A Journey to the Center of the Earth. Chapter 5. Where is the water? The next day our departure took place at a very early hour. There was no time even for the least delay. According to my figures, it would take us 5 days to get back to the place where the tunnels divided. I can never describe all the suffering we endured on the way back. My uncle accepted the suffering in silence, finally convinced that he had made a great error by choosing the eastern tunnel. Hans, the strong man, accepted all that came his way with quiet strength. As for myself, well, I must admit that I did nothing but complain about the terrible situation we were in. As I had expected, our supply of water gave out completely on the first day's march. I was so tired that more than once I came close to collapsing on the rocky ground. When this finally did happen, Hans and my uncle stopped and tried to comfort me, but I could see that fatigue and lack of water were torturing my uncle as well. After a time I moved along without thinking or feeling. I remember nothing of this period of time except that it was like a horrible nightmare. At last, at 10 o'clock in the morning, our Tuesday, the 8th of July, after crawling on our hands and knees for many hours, more dead than alive, we reached the point where the eastern tunnel began. I lay like a dog on the hard, dry lava, unable to rise. Deep groans and sighs passed from my lips. Then I fell into a faint. Soon, I felt my uncle lift me tenderly in his arms. Through the fog that had enveloped my mind, I heard him tearfully say, "Poor boy." I tried to speak, but I could not. I squeezed his trembling hand to show him that I was all right. He reached to the ground and brought up his drinking gourd, then put it to my lips. "Drink, my poor boy, drink," he said. Had I heard right? Was my uncle mad? Yet, before I could ask myself those questions a second time, a mouthful of water cooled my parched lips and throat. "One mouthful of water, the very last," my uncle said. "I've saved it at the bottom of my bottle for you. 20 times, 100 times I've resisted the temptation to drink it. I knew that when we reached this point, you would need it to go on." "Thank you, my dear uncle," I cried. "Thank you from the bottom of my heart." And a big tear rolled down my feverish cheeks. My uncle smiled kindly. "Well," I said, "there's little doubt about what we must do now. There is no more water. Therefore, our journey is at an end. Let us return to Sneffels." "Go back?" my uncle said, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "Must it be that way?" "Yes," I cried. "Go back, and now. We haven't a moment to lose." "So, my dear Harry," the professor said after a moment's silence, "those few drops of water have not brought back your energy or your courage. I couldn't believe what I was hearing." "Aren't you discouraged, sir?" I asked. "What?" he bellowed. "Give up just when we are on the verge of success? Never, never shall it be said that Professor Hardwigg gave up." "Then we must make up our minds to die," I said quietly. "No," my uncle answered. Go back and take Hans with you. I will go on alone." "You ask us to leave you?" "Leave me, I say. I will complete this journey, or I will never return to the surface of the earth. Now go." I couldn't believe what my uncle was saying. I went to Hans, who sat quietly watching the scene between my uncle and myself. I caught his hand in mine, but he never moved a muscle. I pointed the way up, the way to the summit of Mount Sneffels. The Icelander gently shook his head and pointed to my uncle. "Master," he said quietly. "The master is a madman," I cried. "We must drag him with us. Do you hear me?" Although I tugged furiously at his arm, Hans did not move an inch. Then my uncle spoke, quietly, yet firmly enough to get my instant attention. "My good Harry, be calm," he said. "Listen to what I have to say to you." I sat back then, folded my arms, and looked my uncle squarely in the eye. "The lack of water is the sole obstacle to the success of our journey," he said. "In all of our travels, we have found no water. However, while you were unconscious, I explored the entrance to the other 3 tunnels, and I found that one goes directly downward into the bowels of the earth. If we follow that one, it will take us directly to the layer of rock that is guaranteed to have springs. We shall have all the water we need in a few hours." I said nothing. "One more day, that is all I ask," he added. "If we find no water within that time, I will give up this journey, and we will all return to the surface." I knew how much this journey meant to my uncle and how great a chance he was taking by making this offer. So I had to agree to the 1 day. "Let us go then," I said. "1 day, and we then return to the surface where we belong." Now we began our second descent, this one into the western shaft. The tunnel we entered and traveled along was a fissure in the earth, probably caused when the hot earth began to cool at the beginning of its life. For a geologist, this was a paradise of rock specimens never before seen by man. I could have spent days just looking and touching the many rock formations with threads of copper, magnesium, platinum, and gold running through them. It was now 8 o'clock and we still had not found any water. The sufferings I endured were horrible, but my ears were alert to catch the sound of a spring. I listened and listened, but never did I hear a drop. Suddenly, I felt a deadly faint come over me. My legs refused to support me any longer. My eyes could not see. I gave one despairing cry and began to fall forward. "Help! Help! I'm dying!" I cried. But just before my eyes closed, I saw my uncle standing over me, his face tortured with pain and sorrow. "All is over," he said quietly. When I opened my eyes again, I saw my uncle and Hans lying near me, wrapped in their sleeping rugs. Were they asleep or dead? I could not think of sleeping. All I could think of was the miles and miles of Earth's crust above me, weighing on me like some giant cloak, crushing me in my granite bed. I lay there for hours. The silence was like a tomb. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. Hans was moving away from our camp with a lamp in his hands. "Hans is leaving us," I cried. "Hans! Hans! If you are a man, come back!" Then I realized that those words were spoken only to myself. I was immediately ashamed of my suspicions. Hans was going down deeper into the tunnel, not up. He must be searching for water that could save us. Had he, in the silence of the earth, heard the sound of a spring? Chapter 6. The Hansbach. When Hans didn't return in the next hour, wild reasons why he would have left us crossed my mind, each reason crazier than the last. I must have either been half or wholly mad. Suddenly I heard the sound of footsteps coming up the tunnel and saw Hans's light shining on the walls of the passage. Hans approached my uncle and gently wakened him. My uncle instantly rose and asked, "Well?" "Water," said Hans without a trace of emotion. "Water! Water!" I cried wildly, clapping my hands and jumping up and down. "Where?" asked my uncle. "Below." We quickly got ready to move, and within a short time we were making a rapid descent into the tunnel. An hour later we advanced 1,000 yards and had descended 2,000 feet. At that moment I heard a familiar sound, a kind of dull roar like that of a distant waterfall. Hans was right, my uncle cried happily. That is the roar of moving water. There can be no doubt? I asked, still afraid to be certain. There's not the slightest doubt about it, my uncle answered. An underground river is running beside us somewhere. At first, it sounded like the river ran right above our heads. Then, the sound came from the wall to our left. I touched the hard rock, hoping to find a sign of moisture or the coolness of the water. But all I could feel was the hard rock itself. We advanced down the tunnel. Half an hour passed, then an hour. We could hear the water, but it was so deeply buried in the hard rock that we could not touch or see it. We continued to walk, but the sound of the water seemed to be getting dimmer. It was obvious that we were moving away from the water, so we retraced our steps to the point where we could hear the water the loudest. There we stood silently and stared at the wall. In a few moments, a smile broke across Hans's face. He went to the wall, put his ear against it, and smiled again. Then he picked up a crowbar and began attacking the wall 3 feet above the tunnel floor. Saved, I cried. We're saved. Yes, cried my uncle, even more excited than I. Hans is right. We would never have thought of that ourselves. After an hour's work with the crowbar, Hans had made a hole 6 inches wide and 2 feet deep into the rock. The hole could not be wider, or else it would bring the entire wall down on Hans and on us. The waiting was terrible. I could taste the water so much that my lips and throat became even more parched than before. My uncle and I were just getting ready to go to work on the wall ourselves, whatever the danger, when we heard a loud, welcome hiss. Then a jet of water burst through the wall with such force that it hit the opposite side of the tunnel. Hans cried out in pain. I did not understand why until I plunged my hands into the sparkling water and drew back with a wild, frantic cry. It's boiling hot, I cried in disappointment and pain. Well, never mind, said my uncle. It will soon cool. My uncle was right. In a short time, enough of the liquid was cool for each of us to have a long drink. We drank greedily without really tasting the water at all. Afterwards, I realized that the water had a mineral taste to it. Since we are the first travelers to discover the stream, my uncle said, I think we should name it after Hans. Agreed, I said. We named the stream Hansbach, or Hans's Stream. I wanted to fill our goat skins with the precious liquid, but my uncle explained that the flowing water would follow us in our descent and provide refreshment when we needed it. Then there's no reason why we cannot now continue on our journey, I said. Ah, my boy, my uncle said, laughing, you have finally begun to believe that the journey is possible. Not only possible, sir, I said, but I am now confident of our success. Let us get on with our descent. But my uncle was not ready. Just a moment, he said. It is night, and we ought to sleep for a while before we continue. By the next day, Thursday, when we awoke, I had forgotten all our past suffering. We had a good breakfast, drank our fill of the water that had been cooling all night long, and began our descent at 8 o'clock in the morning. The tunnel moved downward in twists and turns to the southwest according to my uncle's compass. That day and the next, we did a considerable amount of horizontal, but very little vertical traveling, although at times the way did get steep. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, we estimated our position to be 90 miles southeast of Reykjavik, Iceland, and about 7.5 miles deep into the earth. We now received a startling surprise. Under our feet, there opened a deep well. It went straight down into the earth and was frightening to look at. But my uncle did not think so. Look at this, he cried with delight. The rock projections on this wall will serve as a staircase to take us a long way into the bowels of the earth. Hans got out the ropes, and we began our descent into the well. We were, in fact, descending a narrow spiral much like the staircase found in some homes. As trained geologists, we had done climbing such as this before, and once we began the descent, it did not seem too bad an idea at all. After a while, however, our calves ached, and we had to stop to rest every 15 minutes. We ate and drank as we rested, for the water from the Hansbach flowed down the well along with us. During the next 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, we followed this spiral staircase downward, going about 6 miles further into the earth. We were now about 15 miles below sea level. On Monday, however, at about noon, the well took a more gentle slope, and we traveled more on a road. We traveled that road until Wednesday the 15th, when we were actually 21 miles below sea level. My uncle calculated that we were approximately 150 miles from Sneffels, where we had begun our journey 15 days before. "If your calculations are right, Uncle," I said, "we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" he asked. "We can easily find out," I said, pulling out a map and compass. I measured carefully, then held a map out to my uncle. "You see," I said, "those 150 miles to the southeast put us under the open sea." "Under the open sea!" cried my uncle with delight. "No doubt," I said. "The ocean floor is over our head this very minute." The idea was not such a pleasant one to me. The mighty Atlantic Ocean was resting on the granite roof over my head. 3 days later, Saturday, the 18th of July, we reached a vast grotto, a kind of underground cavern. My uncle decided that the next day being Sunday, we should have a day of rest. We're going to call it a day there for now. Please reach down, click like, and subscribe if you haven't. We'll read Chapter 7 in the next video.